Hi, I'm Susie. I'm going to be going over the microorganisms, so section 1. So there are two different fermentation processes, alcoholic fermentation and malolactic fermentation. Alcoholic fermentation is carried out by yeasts, where the yeast converts sugar found in grapes into ethanol and carbon dioxide. On the other hand, malolactic fermentation is carried out by lactic acid bacteria, which converts malic acid, which is a tart acid that's found in grapes, into carbon dioxide and creamy lactic acid. This process reduces wine acidity, it increases the pH, and provides a buttery aroma and flavor to the wine. Malolactic fermentation also contributes to microbial stability and occurs after alcoholic fermentation. So the yeast that's responsible for alcoholic fermentation is Saccharomyces. Saccharomyces contains a scope of individual characteristics that are not found in other genera. They have a high capacity to ferment sugars, a high tolerance to alcohol, and they have the ability to compete with other species and colonize the wine medium. They can be used in both dry and liquid form. The common strain used is Saccharomyces cerevisiae because of its controlled and predictable fermentation. The use of wild yeast has increased greatly throughout the past decade, and wild yeasts are useful to avoid a slow and stuck fermentation, to increase microbial diversity, and to ultimately enhance the character of the wine. The use of non-Saccharomyces can also increase the concentration of the preferred mediators like citric and pyruvic acids, which can improve the malolactic fermentation performance. The lactic acid bacteria that's responsible for malolactic fermentation is Enococcus oni, Pediococcus pentasaceus, Pediococcus damnosus, Lactobacillus casei, Lactobacillus plantarum, and Leuconostoc. I'm so sorry if I said all of those wrong. Some lactic acid bacteria can be homofermentative or heterofermentative. Homofermentative is when they produce only lactic acid and CO2 from sugars, and heterofermentative means that it can create multiple end products like ethanol, acetic acid, and CO2 from the fermenting sugars. Enococcus ini is an aerobic bacterium that's capable of using oxygen for cellular respiration, but it is able to gain energy through fermentation. They thrive in acidic conditions and have been proven to reduce the length of malolactic fermentation. They stabilize the wine communities by consuming the nutrients available to them and lowering the potential growth of other microbes. They are heterofermentative, gram-positive, and grow optimally in sugar and protein-rich media. They grow in chains or pairs and are spherically shaped, and they're typically responsible for malolactic fermentation due to their ability to tolerate extreme pH and ethanol levels. The bacteria Pediococcus is spherical, never elongated, and gram-positive. They're non-motile and aerobic. The division is in pairs and it forms tetrads. Chains don't form, and single cells are rare. Pediococcus pentaceus and Pediococcus damnosus have a homofermentative metabolism. Next, lactobacillus are gram-positive, rod-shaped bacteria. They're anaerobic and non-spore forming. They're acid tolerant and catalase negative. They're typically found in the intestines, and they're an important part of our health. The name lactobacillus indicates the enzyme that it produces, which is lactic acid. A special characteristic of lactobacilli is that it produces bacteriocins, which enables them to combat spoilage. Lactobacillus contains more enzyme-encoding genes than Enococcus ini, which is important for the aroma compounds of wine. Leuconostoc is oval or spherical in shape and found singularly or in pairs. It's gram-positive, non-motile, and catalase-negative bacteria. They're heterofermentative and can adapt to conditions like high ethanol levels, low pH or temperatures, and sulfur dioxide presence. Now on to section 2.
Hello everyone, my name is Darnie Reach and I will be discussing the growth and fermentation process in winemaking. When it comes to winemaking, this step is very important because it can potentially determine the following characteristics of the wine: flavor, texture, aroma, color, quality, and taste. When it comes to microbial growth, the following factors are very crucial. temperature, pH, water, activity, moisture, and climate. Some studies outside of the agricultural world have shown that the soil's pH, moisture, temperature, and nutrient availability are the main source of microbial growth. The fungi and bacteria found in soil occupy specific openings, which in turn responds differently to precipitation and soil pH, which would therefore result in a different response to climate change on their diversity, abundance, and functional potential. The water found in soil affects the composition of the microbe by changing the availability of oxygen, resulting in microbial respiration. In winemaking, there are two main types of fermentation: alcohol fermentation and malolactic fermentation. Temperature is very important when it comes to fermentation because it can potentially affect both chemical and sensory properties of wine. Alcohol fermentation, which is also known as primary fermentation, is responsible for turning the grape must into wine, and the yeast Saccharomyces cerevisiae consumes the natural grape sugars and then produces alcohol and carbon dioxide, along with other byproducts that contribute to the sensory characteristics of wine. Artificial yeast, like the one I mentioned earlier, either in dried or liquid form, is then added to assist with the controlling of fermentation. This is done by the consumption of most of the sugars found in the grape, which then produces carbon dioxide and alcohol along with a large number of molecules, which are known as superior alcohols and esters, which influences the flavors and aromas of the wine. This process also involves an exothermic chemical reaction that has to be precisely managed, since high temperatures can increase the risk of flavor evaporation and may also cause the fermentation to stick. Lower temperatures tend to encourage preservation of significant aromas, which are normally produced from esters that are formed from fatty acids and higher alcohols. Esters are normally responsible for the fruity and floral flavors and aromas of wines. One example of this would be ethyl hexanate, which is an ethyl ester that produces notes of strawberries and green apples. Higher fermentation temperatures, ones that go above 30 degrees Celsius or 86 degrees Fahrenheit, increases the rate of fermentation, which may result in a production of undesirable products that has been produced by the yeast. Some common flavors associated with high temperatures and quick fermentation are sulfur compounds, which include hydrogen, sulfide, and disulfide. And these aromas are normally associated with flavors like rotten eggs or cooked cabbage or skunk. Malolactic fermentation, also known as secondary fermentation, in winemaking normally occurs after alcohol fermentation is done, or it can also occur during alcohol fermentation. This is caused by the presence of the bacteria Ornithococcus oene, and this process is responsible for softening the taste and texture of the wine, along with stabilizing the wine before bottling. Malic acid is responsible for the tart acid found in grapes and also in green apples, whereas lactic acid is responsible for more of a creamy acid, which can be found in milk and cheese. Red wines tend to be harsh and astringent before malolactic fermentation is done.
Hi, I'm Jenna, and I'll be talking about wine production. So, as a brief overview, the Encyclopedia Britannica groups wine production into three major steps. And so you have the harvest of the grapes, and then you have crushing them, and then you have fermenting them. And then some textbooks, such as Understanding Food, which you might be familiar with, also adds racking and aging to that process. The two are different because racking is letting the wine sit so that the sediment or like the died off yeast and other materials will settle out of it as much as possible, and then the wine is drawn out so it is as pure as possible, even though some sediment will still remain, and then it is aged. That more pure wine gets aging, depending if it's red or white, because red wine is usually aged longer because it tends to have earthier tones. When you age wine, the fruitier notes in that wine are the first to go as it ages, and so white wine, which is usually desired to be a little more fruitier tasting, is not aged for as long. So we're going to go a little more in depth into harvesting and crushing and fermenting the grapes. So wine grapes are harvested when their sugar content's going to be the highest. And if you took nutrition classes, you may remember that the ripeness of a fruit impacts how much fruit sugar is currently present and what it tastes like. So they are harvested, and this sugar is what's going to feed those yeasts. Yeast need fuel to perform fermentation, specifically carbohydrates, and so in wine, those carbs are those fruit sugars, and fermentation is controlled by that, and so the yeast will die off by like autolysis when there is no more sugar left to feed them, or they will, settle down as sediment. And so after this harvest, they are washed and crushed and added to fermentation tanks. More yeast is usually added with them because a small amount of yeast tends to be present, like just on top of the grapes normally. So to make sure that they will ferment fully, we add some more like commercial yeast to the wine. And so as those yeasts absorb that fruit sugar, they're going to be releasing carbon dioxide and alcohol, which is where we get that in the wine. And later I'm going to talk about in a second how the process can be a little more hands-on or almost look like a factory setting, depending on how local that it is or how outsourced places that you get the grapes from. Yes, and so after fermentation, wine is racked, and then it is drawn out and aged for a little bit, and then it is bottled and shipped to consumers. So, increasingly, wine production is veering more towards the sustainability side. There were two studies which I have cited in my paper and also in the slides that specifically looked at how customers are starting to desire more environmentally safe, sustainable wine production. And so that can mean things like less water is used and less like pesticides, things like that in their production. And so at the very end, I compared two Portuguese wines for a little bit of a look into how wine can be either very commercial or very local. So one of these manufacturers grew the grapes, harvested them on the same farm, and then his farmhouse and the factory for processing the grapes was right there in that same farm. And so it's all done in one place from one place, and a lot like less commercial processes were used for the actual steps of this winemaking versus for another type of Portuguese wine. Grapes were outsourced from several different areas and brought into one factory, which was not near the farm where the grapes were grown. And then a lot of commercial processes were used between start to finish. So the like solids in the wine were separated by a centrifuge, and other kinds of machines were used in that. And then rather than storing all of the end product at once, wine was shipped out according to demand, because for that amount of commercial winemaking, the storage costs could be pretty high. So, yes, and there are your fun facts about winemaking, and I hope you guys enjoy the information, and we are on to part 4.
Hey everyone, my name is Theodora Sambrew, and I am going to be talking about wine spoilage today. So, why does wine spoil? Wine usually spoils due to exposure to a bacteria known as Decarabruxelensis. I apologize if I butcher the pronunciation, but yeah, it spoils when it's exposed to that bacteria, and that's what causes the smoky or horsey taste known as Brett character. Being exposed to low humidity or high humidity also spoils wine. Heat and light as well spoils wine, and lactic acid bacteria such as the heterofermentative cocci or cocci, and that produces a nose wrinkling smell. So I'm going to be talking about the shelf life of wines and with the different types of wines. So we have fine wine, which usually lasts for decades. That's the type of wine that gets better with age, and that's the most expensive type of wine. And we have cheaper wine, which usually lasts 6 months to 2 years. Then we have organic wine, which lasts at most 6 months. We have refined wines, and they last approximately 1 month after opening. And to make sure that they stay fresh, not fresh, but still good enough to consume, they're supposed to be closed and or resealed and put into a fridge at the right temperature, or to make sure that there's no oxygen, or it's not exposed to oxygen. And we have sparkling wine, and that lasts the shortest amount of time. Once it opens, it's supposed to be consumed within 24 hours at most. Now I'm going to be discussing maintaining the quality of wine or wine storage. So wine should be stored at temperatures between -4 and -13 degrees Celsius. They should be laid on their side, or like lying down, and kept in shelves in order to keep the corks moist, and that prevents it drying out and cracking, and that also prevents oxygen from getting into the bottles. Also, that method of storage creates more space to be able to store more wine. So life hack, they should be kept in a cool, dry place in order to regulate the humidity. Humidity should always be between 60 to 68%. And if you're very interested in wine and you drink wine a lot, it would be best to invest in a wine refrigerator, because it's easier to it's just easier to have a refrigerator that's at the right temperature and right humidity as well. And that's the end of me talking about the spoilage of wine and how to make sure you have good wine. I'm going to talk about fun facts about wine now. So, fun fact number 1, wine never truly spoils. It it just becomes vinegar. So once it spoils, that's it goes through oxygen, it's exposed to oxygen, and then it just gets a really bad taste and a different smell, and it becomes vinegar. And I believe that's what they use for wine vinegar. But yeah, wine never truly spoils. It just becomes something else. So second fun fact, the Titanic has the oldest wine cellar in the world. And also the cellar, all the wine that is found in the cellar, sorry, my brain just, yeah. But all the wine that is found in the cellar is actually still in good condition. But I don't know why no one's going to retrieve it, but it is there. And also, third fun fact, wine doesn't contain cholesterol or fat. But yeah, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much.